Welcome to Praxis, a podcast where we explore how to practice and embody the way of Jesus in our everyday lives. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen. We are in a series right now focused on cultivating a healthy church culture. Every church has a culture, whether they realize it or not, and some cultures are reasonably healthy, while others are not. And while no church is perfect, part of the work every church needs to engage in is intentionally working to close the gap wherever it exists between where they are and what it looks like to be a healthy community. So in this series, that's what we're doing. We're seeking to help close that gap. This involves not only talking about the marks of an unhealthy church culture, but also casting vision for how we as the church can embody a way of life together that, while it may not be perfect, is oriented towards goodness and kindness and love. And today, we want to talk about a powerful toxin in the soil of unhealthy church cultures, which is being personality-driven. So let's get into it.
Well, welcome everyone. My name is Mac.
I'm Katie.
And I'm Josiah.
It is good to be with you guys. But not everybody's here. Normally, Adam Johnson, our producer, is sitting here with us, and he's not here. And the reason why is because he gets married tomorrow.
He does.
Yes, he does.
Pretty exciting. And aren't you like the best man?
I am the best man.
Yep. And I'm officiating. Katie, you'll be there. But it just got me thinking, I feel like at some point, Katie, you said you've been in 23 weddings or something. How do you guys feel about being in weddings?
Oh, that's funny you ask. We were just talking about that before this.
Yeah.
Me and Josiah. Yeah, definitely not 23, but it's been a lot.
Like how many would you say?
Probably at least 10.
Wow.
But it's always an honor, you know? It's really cool to be in relationship with people that well, that they ask you to have that spot in their life. But there was a season when it was like kind of a lot all at once. And that
because all your friends were getting married and it was like, okay,
the traveling and fly here for a bachelorette party. And there's obviously a lot of money involved. And so there was a season when it felt like a lot.
I have to buy a ton of dresses.
And then it got to the point where I got married kind of at the tail end of that season. And then I was like, well, shoot, what do I can only have so many bridesmaids. What do I do now for my wedding? You know,
20 of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have probably been in, it's probably 7 or 8, I think, between like my brothers and a few friends. Probably 7 or 8 weddings. I will say, though, that I don't recall ever going to a wedding that I wasn't doing something in it.
Oh, sure, because
Really?
you're talented.
What?
Between doing music.
Yeah.
You've never just showed up and ate and danced and hung out?
I don't remember a time.
Wow.
Maybe when I was a kid.
You're missing
that got
out.
involved. I know. I don't even know what it's like. Usually people ask, invite me to the wedding. They're like, hey, you should sing something. Or, officiated a couple. So I just feel like I've been a part of so many weddings. And I've never really got to just go without having any responsibilities.
Maybe someday.
Maybe someday.
Well, I have been at least one wedding with Katie, and it gets a little ridiculous on the dance floor. We'll just put it that way.
Depends how late you stay.
It got a little crazy. Not in a bad way, but just like, wow, okay, we're doing burpees in a bridesmaid dress.
Yeah.
Like that kind of
Is
a thing.
burpees a dance move? Though?
No, but Katie
It is
made
in my
it into
world.
it.
It is in my world. It must have fit the song, whatever it was. I like to
It was
dance in that
hilarious.
That's fun.
Well, speaking of burpees, we're in a series right now on cultivating healthy church culture. Cultivating healthy church cultures. If you didn't get a chance to listen to the previous episode, I would encourage you to go back and listen to it because we covered a lot of ground. We kind of set the stage for the rest of the conversation. But big picture, last episode, we named that every church has a culture, whether we realize it or not. And I would expand that to say every organization, every company, every school, et cetera, has a culture.
That's a good expand.
And while some churches have a healthy culture, we're seeing signs of widespread dysfunction in churches across the United States. And we're looking at how that dysfunction results from unhealthy or toxic cultures. So last episode, Mac introduced this metaphor of a fruit tree as a way of talking about 3 subcultures within a church. We said how a fruit tree has branches that bear fruit. It has a trunk that feeds and supports the branches, and then it has roots that suck up nutrients from the soil. And we said that the most important subculture is the soil, because if the soil isn't healthy, the tree won't be healthy, and it won't be able to produce healthy fruit. So in this episode and the next couple episodes, we want to name some of the toxins in the cultural soil that are contributing to unhealthy church cultures. Okay?
Yeah,
so
I
far?
got it.
Yeah.
I'm with you. By
Okay.
the way, that metaphor of the branches, the trunk, the fruit, not mine. So that was
Yes.
from the book Pivot by Scott McKnight and his daughter Laura.
Yes, good attribution. We wouldn't want to plagiarize.
Yes.
All right, so let me take a stab. The first toxin I want to name today is being personality driven. So sometimes a church can build a culture around a single person, which I think typically tends to be the lead pastor, and this can create a really unhealthy culture. A lead pastor-centric church that orbits around the pastor's personality and gifting, I think it's fair to say, will not be a healthy church. And yet it's kind of commonplace. I think, again, as I started thinking about this, I could point to lots of examples to churches I've been to or been familiar with that do orbit around the lead pastor. And I was just getting coffee with someone a couple months ago maybe, who had recently moved to the area, and she and her husband and kids were looking for a church. And she said something like, I'm noticing something as I visit churches in the area. It seems like a lot of churches tend to be built around a person. Like I just notice people talk about, I go to so-and-so's church, or I go to so-and-so's church. And that doesn't feel right to me. And I affirmed her. I see that too. I see that sometimes even in our church, where I think we try to be pretty intentional about not doing that. I think in some ways we're so accustomed, at least in this culture, to go, well, the person I see on stage speaking is kind of like the main actor here. Mm-hmm. And that's what this is all about. I go to Max Church, or even, Josiah, you're on the stage all the time. Like, it's easy to orient the church around who we're seeing on stage. So what would you guys add to that?
Well, I would say it's not just about organizing. There is that sense in which you're organizing the church around a single person. But I think what I would also add to that is it seems like one of the primary things we're noticing is that person also creates, there's like a momentum around building that person's status as a result. Mm. They sort of then have celebrity status. So it's not just organizational control. Mm-hmm. It's also a sense of celebrity that within the church and that goes beyond it. So I know many of our listeners are readers, and so I just mentioned a book by Caitlin Beatty. It's called Celebrities for Jesus: How Personas, Platforms, and Profits Are Hurting the Church. And she just shows that this celebrityism is a core feature of the contemporary evangelical movement. A celebrity culture is not just a minor feature, it's like a main staple within the evangelical church, where all the attention revolves around the lead pastor, sort of what you're naming, but then the church ends up being built around this personality who has immense social power, often without the proximity of the people who are actually present. And so in this book, and I've read it, she just does a great job outlining how pervasive this is, to your point, Katie, but also how insidious it is. The church, instead of resisting and challenging the celebrity culture around us, has come to mimic it. And it's not good, nor does it produce a culture of goodness.
Yeah, I heard you say something I'm curious if you could expand on just a bit. You named that they have the status, but without the proximity. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, she mentions that. I listened to her talk on a podcast, and she mentions the impact without the influence without the proximity being like a sort of like a formula for creating a celebrity type of.
Yeah, so I think what I hear you guys saying is, as the lead pastor, you can't possibly be in close relationship with everyone in your church.
Yes,
right?
But I also think she's naming a cultural phenomena within evangelical Christianity that goes beyond just a local congregation. Okay, think about some of the bigger names, even ones we've named that have experienced moral failures. They had a platform that drew thousands of people outside of their local church context, and people were tuning in every week. So they have all this social prestige and power and influence to speak into people's lives that they've never even met before.
Got it.
And yet they're not proximate to those people, their locations or whatever, and nobody can actually vouch for their character because you actually don't know this person. You're just listening to them, right? She also, I wasn't planning on saying this, but she does a great distinction in the book between being famous and a celebrity. Those two are not the same. There are plenty of godly people. And I remember when we had that moment when we were talking about this a little bit with Cameron episodes ago, where he brought up, who's the guy that just eats liver? Liver King.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, that's someone who's clearly trying to build a platform for himself and to become a celebrity, a social influencer. That's very different than someone who's like embodied a way of life that is so admirable that they gain recognition from other people. And we all could think of people like that. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr., for instance. So one primary staple of evangelicalism is creating positions where a church revolves around a lead pastor, and their primary motive is to build a platform for themselves where they sort of further their celebrityism. Make sense?
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Let's talk for a little bit just about how he got here, because I think this might be helpful.
Yeah.
The catalyst for this becoming such a staple within evangelicalism was the church growth movement. I'll probably say more about this in future episodes. There were two missiologists, Donald McGavran and Peter Wagner, who sort of pioneered this. But they laid the foundation for what would become the seeker-friendly or attractional church model. And the basic goal of that model was just what it sounds like, to attract as many people as possible to your church. That's the goal of an attractional model of church ministry. Let's get as many people to come to us. And so the question was, well, how do you do that? And the basic strategy became to have the best religious goods and services that spiritual consumers would like to consume. So we saw this in churches in the 80s and 90s, very focused on drawing seekers, attracting people. And how did they do that? They had the best kids programming, the best youth program, the best small groups, men's ministry, women's ministry, worship, all of that. But central to the success of this model, in fact, I would argue that if this isn't in place, it doesn't even work, is a charismatic and gifted teacher and preacher. Right? Sort of a sage on the stage to captivate and hold people's attention week after week. And so this became arguably the key ingredient to the success of this entire model. Without it, it doesn't work. You need to have someone who's really gifted as a speaker and communicator that people are wanting to come listen to week after week. Okay? So follow this. We're going to keep going for a minute. At the center of the attractional model of ministry became talented lead pastors who could wow crowds and sort of captivate people's attention with their words. Now, what this does over time is that it changes the job description of pastors. Okay, the job description changes for pastors from actually pastoring people, having proximity to people, caring for people, to now performing for people. You see that? So there's this shift in a job description from pastoring people to performing for people, as well as then the qualification changes. The qualification for pastoring shifts from character to competency. Okay, so just think about this. Now, all of a sudden, the job description becomes, we need people who have incredibly strong gifting from the stage, who are good at performing in front of crowds, who exude confidence and conviction. And then think about how that acts on the person. Right now, all of a sudden, you get a job and your primary job is to perform in front of people with a microphone, with a spotlight on you. That is going to have a shaping influence on the person you're becoming, right? Moreover, we've actually created a job description then that is looking for people who love being in the spotlight and being that center of attention. And then we're all of a sudden shocked and surprised, for instance, when lo and behold, it comes out that actually this person has narcissistic tendencies or isn't good at relationships, treats people poorly or whatever. And I want to go, it shouldn't be a surprise. Because we actually changed the job description from pastoring people to performing for people, and the primary qualification went from character to competency, particularly on the stage. Is this making sense?
Yeah, it almost feels like it sounds more like a Taylor Swift concert and less like an early church Acts 2 vision of the church, where a group of people were just all being the church together, trying to figure out, like, how do we live life in the way of Jesus? Well, why don't you teach, and maybe I'll host in my home, and you make food, and you care for people. Like, we're all coming together and being the church. That's very different from going, here's this one person that we're coming to see who might have some really great things that inspire me and help me grow in my faith in certain ways, but where it's hyper-focused on the person who's speaking for God.
Yes, and we'll get into this, I know, in our next episode, but at least let's circle back to something we talked about at length last time, which is that the culture that exists in a church is the sum total of everyone's participation in the relational patterns that exist. It's not just determined by one person, it's the ongoing interaction between the congregation and church leadership, okay? So it'd be easy to just blame narcissistic lead pastors for this, but in fact, I want to name that the congregations are complicit in this. A pastor can't stand on a pedestal unless people put him there, right? There's no spotlight for the celebrity pastor apart from the adoring gaze of the congregation that shows up every week. So we're all participating. To the degree this is in place, everybody's contributing in some way.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. This reminds me of a story in the Old Testament from 1 Samuel chapter 8 when Israel is requesting to have a king. So up until this point, God spoke and gave direction through a prophet or through a mouthpiece. And so essentially the whole nation was dependent on what God is going to say to them and for direction and for everything they needed. But the prophet Samuel is getting older, and Israel asks and says, we want a king instead. We want someone to lead us. And God warned them that it would come at a great cost. There's this section of the scripture where it's basically this king is going to claim his rights. He's going to require wealth and military and women and all these other things. It's listing all these things, all the things that the leader's going to take for his own if you choose to put your trust in a king instead of me. And they responded, and I think I'm just going to read it because I think it's so interesting. It said, the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles. It's interesting that up until this point, God was already doing those things for them. But Israel wanted a king to be able to do that, someone they could be proud of. I hear so much pride in the statement. So why did they want a king? Well, they wanted the status, they wanted the protection and the stability. They wanted to be like all the other nations. And if you fast forward, the first king didn't do such a great job, right? And he had major issues, and just about every other king in the line, including David, had major issues as well. So this was happening then. Obviously, this happens now. We're human beings, and we have this desire and this need, like we all want this strong leader we can look to, right? Someone to fight our battles for us, someone we can be proud of and say, I go to so-and-so's church, someone we can put our hope and our trust in and our faith in. And the issue, I don't know, the way I reflect on it is this issue of creating this personality-driven culture isn't simply the leader's doing, right? You just alluded to it. It's the entire church's responsibility of creating this, and it's human nature. So just as Israel created their leadership issues, I think we do the same in our unhealthy churches.
Yeah, so what I hear you saying is this is nothing new.
No.
Yeah, like God was to be Israel's king. They already had a king, but they request a human king. The church already has a king. His name is Jesus, but congregations still want a king that they can point to. And this puts just like a crushing weight on leaders. And you named it. Throughout Israel's history, none of the earthly kings ultimately succeeded. They were all crushed under the weight of trying to lead the people. They failed. You know? And now we're seeing that too in our culture. When we put that much weight on a human leader, they're bound to fail us, and we keep seeing failure after failure. And it's not just this realm. You know, back in December, I preached on we were doing that series on the women in Matthew's genealogy. And one of the women that's mentioned is Bathsheba. She's not mentioned by name. It's she of Uriah. But I presented that I think the main reason why Matthew includes she of Uriah is to highlight David's failure as king, and to point to the fact that when you trust human kings, it will lead to that failure in order to prepare them for the one true king that won't let them down or fail them. After that sermon, I had someone come up to me who is a politician. Like, she is a public figure. And she was just sort of in tears and just saying, man, this is also happening in politics. People put so much weight and expectation and it's unbearable. Like, we weren't designed to carry that kind of weight, right?
Yeah.
So I'm just affirming and interacting with, I think, that point that this is nothing new.
Yeah. So, okay, we could have people that are listening and that would say, okay, like I hear what you're saying. Some churches are built around a personality, and I get that, but like, why is it a bad thing exactly? Like, if you've got a great pastor who gives sermons that are inspiring and point people to deeper faithfulness, like, what exactly is the problem here? Like, shouldn't we want good leaders? And I would just say yes to that. Like, we do want good leaders. We wouldn't disagree with that. And here's what else I would not disagree with. We're not saying that having a strong leader is a problem, right? There's certain qualities that are necessary for good leadership, and some people have that. And like, they just have a quality that makes people want to follow them. We're also not saying that leaders shouldn't be competent or gifted. I think it takes a lot to lead any group of people, especially in a church. And so we want leaders who have competencies and giftedness that lends itself to like setting a vision, getting people excited about living into that vision. We want people who kind of get us excited about like going in they're going in a direction and we want to follow that. So we're not saying that those things are bad in and of themselves, but what we are saying is that building the church around a single person is unhealthy. And so we want to flesh out some of the reasons why. Why is that? What would you guys say?
That's a good question. I hinted at, I think, one of them already, which is just that we become susceptible to unhealthy leaders when we adopt that paradigm. So I shared how, the job description for pastors shifted with the attractional church model, where we go from pastors pastoring people to now performing for people. And when we made that job description change, we basically end up attracting narcissists to lead our churches. And this is where there's a guy named Chuck DeGroat. He wrote a book, When Narcissism Comes to Church, that's super helpful, because this is what he names in an entire book. He talks about how narcissism is being baptized as spiritual giftedness. Narcissistic traits are often presented as strengths. And so he actually names, and I kind of just want to walk through them because I think it would be helpful. He names 10 characteristics of narcissistic pastors. And I'll just say, having experienced a leader like this and having heard stories of other people who have experienced leaders like this, it is so disorienting and so painful to be in proximity to a leader like this. So here are 10 characteristics of a narcissistic pastor. Number one is that all decision-making centers on them. So no significant or meaningful decisions can happen without their blessing or their presence, right? Everything has to be filtered through their yeses and their nos.
No one else is empowered to make decisions.
Correct.
Yeah.
Number two, impatience or lack of ability to listen to other people. They're unable to be present to others with curiosity, empathy, or compassion, right? The compassion, empathy is non-existent in their interactions with other human beings. Number three, delegating without giving proper authority or with too many limits. So they have zero ability to empower others in meaningful ways, which is probably a corollary, I think, to all decision-making centers on them, number one. Number four, feelings of entitlement. They often feel deserving of special treatment compared to those around them. Okay, so like Bill Hybels, for instance, had his own private entrance to the church that he alone could use. Right. But in smaller churches, it might be just like a bigger office, a company car, an account set up at the gas station where they can fill up their car on the church's dime. Like all the special treatment that isn't given to other staff members. Number 5, they feel threatened or intimidated by other staff. So this is the weird thing, is they often exude confidence, and yet they're notoriously insecure. While they project this sense of confidence to those around them, and they're easily threatened by the talent of other people. Number 6, they're needing to be the best and the brightest in the room, which again is probably a corollary to that one just above it. They always need to be the one who has the answer, the final say, the smartest, the most intelligent. There's inconsistency and impulsivity. What drives this is living in a constant state of ego inflation where they can act on whatever they are feeling in the moment. Right? So instead of being like a disciplined person who lives by guiding principles, there's this inconsistency because they feel they have permission to act on whatever their impulses are.
And I would add, aren't worried about the consequences.
Correct. Yep. 3 more. Praising and then withdrawing. So the praise towards the people around comes when those people do something that extends their ego or graders their sense of accomplishment, right? But if someone doesn't behave the way they want them to, doesn't show loyalty, then they withdraw. That relational presence and proximity. Intimidation of others. Sometimes intimidation comes directly with condescension or threats. Other times it's more indirect through triangulation or isolating that person. And then finally is vulnerability. I think that's how you pronounce it. The word faux, F-A-U-X, for those who are listening. It actually originates from the French meaning imitation or not sincere. And so while they might sound or appear vulnerable at times, it's often a very calculated vulnerability rooted in things from the past rather than showing up as a present mess, which is what true vulnerability is about.
That's an interesting one.
Yeah. So all the vulnerability is sort of... it's very presented and packaged in a way. Manufactured vulnerability. So again, if you put all this together, it's like from the stage, they are gifted, charismatic, and engaging. But man, behind closed doors, they are manipulative, abusive, and conniving. They choose power over love, control over the cross, and being a leader over ever being led.
Man, that's fascinating. That last point was really interesting because you're right. I think within Christian circles, we know God wants us to be vulnerable. We admit we're all sinners. We admit we've all made mistakes, but I do think that's a really interesting distinction. If you're being vulnerable only with things that you've already arrived on, only with things that have happened in the past, you're presenting this image as if you have it all together, which seems like a critical piece of this.
Right. And because we know one of the values in our culture right now is authenticity. Right? It gives this appearance of authenticity, but in fact, it's not authentic at all. I even see this not necessarily with narcissistic pastors, but it just requires vulnerability to be honest about things that are messy. And so I've led discipleship groups, for instance, where people are asked to bring a God moment to the table, something they sense God's at work on in their life. And they, instead of everybody else kind of bringing like, this is the moment, it's kind of a mess, let's process it together. They kind of bring something that's already been cleaned up this week, like the settled conclusion. And it's like, see how this like is a deterrent against me showing up with vulnerability and humility because I don't have it all figured out.
Yeah. If the act of being vulnerable just increases your status within the group you're presenting it to, it's probably not real vulnerability.
Yeah,
right? Because it's curated to help sort of bolster this this view of you that or this perception that you're hoping people have of you. It's not necessarily vulnerability for the sake of connecting with people.
The other thing that we were talking about proximity, right? And how that variable is at play with celebrityism. Notice that those 10 characteristics that Chuck outlines for us can't be experienced or discerned without proximity. They're all things that you would experience more behind closed doors or in daily interactions than you would never experience these things from a stage, right? And so this just highlights part of the problem is we put these people on a pedestal and they have maybe 20, 30,000 listeners every week. But here are all these characteristics, 10 of them, and there are more, that fill out a narcissistic personality, none of which can be discerned when you're downloading the podcast or the sermon from the previous week. You just don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I just see this as such a perpetuating problem, because I would dare say that most narcissistic pastors are not there thinking, I'm a tool and I just really want to wreck a bunch of people's lives. Like, no one's thinking that. Mm-hmm. They are there with the intention and the belief that they are what's best for the church. Mm-hmm. So is the problem them? Well, sure, it's part of it. But it just goes to show how much of the culture, the job description change, the expectations from congregations and communities at large of what a pastor and what a church is, all of that shifting has created this perfect soil for continuing to produce narcissistic leaders.
Yeah, the toxin is there due to a variety of variables.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And people who come to church, I think, unfortunately, can be extra susceptible to that. I think a lot of people who come to church are perhaps like in a rough spot, or they're seeking. They want someone who can kind of definitively help provide guidance and help them, connect to God in their life. And so I could see how being in a church especially can make us extra susceptible to that type of leader, unfortunately.
Well, that's my first answer. I mean, you asked the question, why might this be problematic? And I've at least submitted to you guys and to our listeners that we become susceptible to unhealthy leaders. Are there any other problems that you would want to share?
Yeah, I think even if let's just say the leader is healthy, and they're not a narcissistic leader. I don't think it's necessarily healthy. It's not healthy for the congregation to do this to their pastor. So it's not healthy for the congregation to revolve around one person. And I think that, just as we were sort of alluding to, we as a congregation can take our own pride and could probably take a leader that is well-meaning and decent character, capable of taking someone like that who is talented and sort of creating a culture that revolves around their gift and personality. And what ends up happening is that leader can't perform anymore. Everything falls apart. Mm-hmm. The whole system is built around one person being able to perform perfectly. And not only is that going to be bad for the leader, but it's bad for the congregation, because now it's not a conglomerate of mutuality where we all express our gifts and make something beautiful and make up the whole body. Really, a congregation is in a community is really built around a very few set of gifts, and how many people around you are looking around with gifts that don't have an area to express it.
Well, that's a good point. I was going to say, I think it deprives the people in the church of actually meaningfully participating. Mm-hmm. When you think that, I have to be like that in order to do something meaningful here at this church. All I do is I kind of show up and listen and, I don't know, maybe make coffee once in a while or something. It deprives people from feeling like they are a part and have some responsibility and ownership in being the church.
Yeah, they're not taking ownership of the work God's doing in our community, or at least like their own responsibility in that. They're sort of taking pride in being able to support the pastor's vision.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important distinction.
Mm-hmm. Caitlin Beatty, I just grabbed this quote, and she says, the institution, or we'd say the church's identity, becomes enmeshed with the pastor's. His public persona serves to draw fame and renown to the church. Having a celebrity pastor is seen as benefiting the church. All the better if you can get actual celebrities to start attending. Justin Bieber would just come to...
Yeah. I have so many documentaries flashing through my mind right now that I've watched in the past year.
But yeah, dude, I mean, you're naming something really important, which is it's not healthy for the congregation. I mean, if the leader starts going in a poor direction, has the influence to take people with them, that's not good. If the leader has a moral failure or needs to be terminated and everything's built around them, then what? I mean, a lot of people listen to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. I mean, they closed their doors. Yeah. A church of thousands of people, when Mark Driscoll, blew it, they literally closed their doors. If the leader moves on and no one else has been equipped to lead in their place, like retirement or whatever, What does the church do if it's just built around this one person?
Right. It's not only unhealthy while they're there, but it's literally unsustainable if they leave.
Yeah, it just creates a very vulnerable congregation. And I would argue then when there's that enmeshment and sort of like the church's identity has been fused with the pastor isn't really even able to lead very well. So for instance, I was just on a coaching call this morning, and there was a pastor who in his 40s had a near-death experience. And now he's leading a new congregation. And he said, after that near-death experience, I'm pastoring totally differently. He'll tell us more about that. And in what ways? He said, before it would have felt like this church and me are intertwined. Now I realize I could drop dead at any moment. And it's like, so I'm not this church. I'm a pastor to this church, and now I'm able to say things that otherwise I wouldn't be able to say because I would have felt it as a threat, or, what if this person doesn't like me? It's very clear that this is the church and this is me, and they aren't the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if I'm gone, can life continue?
Yeah, and to your point, you guys, around like, hey, and if everything's depending on then other people aren't being empowered. Well, this is one of those keys, is if you can begin making decisions where other people genuinely are contributing and having buy-in, then if something does happen, it was their decision that they made. So just think about this for a moment. If, let's say, we have a decision on our leadership team, and the leadership team is just kind of going along with my choice, and then I get hit by a beer truck on the way home, and now I'm not here anymore, they're stuck with the decision I made. And now it's up to them whether they want to continue my choices or not. Now imagine if you have a team of people who are making that decision together, where there's a process for everybody to give voice, and then at the end of it, it's like, this is our decision.
Yeah.
And then I get hit by a beer truck. Well, now it's not, hey, what do we do with Mac's choice? It's, how do we continue our choice? See the difference?
Yeah, because you're discerning collectively. It's not Mac's discernment. It's our discernment of what the Spirit is leading us to do.
Right.
Yeah. And responsibility and accountability is diffused too if something goes wrong. So I hear you guys saying, all right, even if the leader is healthy, a personality-centric church is not healthy for the congregation. And I would add that it's also not healthy for the leader. So Mac, you touched on this a little earlier. It's just not healthy for a leader to have the congregation revolve around them. I watched the Britney Spears documentary a couple months ago. And
why did you do that?
I don't know.
Okay.
I felt like it probably just popped up. I don't watch a lot of TV, so I was like, well, I grew up in the 90s Britney Spears era, so I was like, this will be interesting. But it was actually really sad. And you just saw kind of all the pressure that was put on her, and she was really young, and how the media treated her. And so it struck me like how the pressure and the weight and the expectations of being so famous, especially at such a young age, really did bad work for her. It really did. And I lived in LA, the LA area, when I went to law school. And so I saw all around me was like people trying to make it big. Like everyone's trying to catch their big break. The
Where'd you go to
waitress
school?
and the Pepperdine.
Yeah. There was a celebrity that walked around the track.
Pamela Anderson.
Yeah, you were friends with Pamela Anderson.
Sure. I wasn't friends with her. I've never talked to her. But yeah, we can say that. You know what other celebrity went to Pepperdine? Do you guys remember the Rod Blagojevich stuff? No. Oh, he was like a super corrupt politician in the Chicago area. Anyways, he went to Pepperdine Law. Other claim to fame.
Where you go to get corrupt,
Anyways, being out there, you just saw everyone trying to make it. So it's like everyone wants that celebrity status, but then when you see it, and actually I watched the Taylor Swift documentary too, and she alluded to like a point in her career when she realized that the celebrity status was acting on her in some ways that did bad work, and she made some intentional choices to kind of push against that and get healthy and just kind of acknowledge some of the expectations that were being placed on her and some decisions about what she wanted to do and what she didn't want to do based on that. So my point being, I would say kind of the same thing for pastors. Like, I don't care how healthy of a person you are coming into a job. If you're put in a position where you're on stage every week having hundreds or even thousands or tens of thousands of people listening to you, if you're the person who makes every decision, who calls the shots, who's basically seen as the face of a church, it might feel good at first, but over time, it will not be good for your soul.
Yeah.
Like having that much attention and that much weight, it can't be good.
Yeah, and to your point, one of you said, I think it was you, Josiah, who said, like, people probably didn't come in with, like, nefarious motivations. In fact, I suspect that many of these pastors came in with a great character. But see, the problem is that the culture acts on and shapes the pastor's character over time. In other words, that culture is acting on the pastor. And so, there's a dynamic of fandom that is not good, right? If you're always in the spotlight, it begins to act on that pastor, and before you know it, you don't know who you are apart from that spotlight, apart from that platform. Which is why I think it's really good for pastors to intentionally find spaces of obscurity where they're not in the spotlight, where they know who they are apart from their church or the platform or the stage or the microphone.
You know, when I think about this, I think about in the Garden of Eden, the temptation to take the apple was like, you know, obviously there was a lie. You will not surely die, right? Mm-hmm. And he says, you will be like God. Your eyes will be opened. I think that the leadership in this capacity is the desire to try to be like God. And there's a line between when we leave sort of our human limitations and try to be more. And when we're forced to be more or try to be more, we aren't designed for it. We're designed to be humans who bear God's image. But we have limits.
Limitations.
We are designed with limits, and all of these narcissistic tendencies really have to do with the fact that I end here and you end here, but I'm going to cross over that boundary. I'm going to try to be more than I actually am, more than human, to try to be a leader that's larger than life. And anytime someone does that, it will crush them.
Yeah.
People are not designed for that. It will take an active amount of rejecting that status in order to survive.
Dude, I think that's such an insightful word that you have to intentionally embrace and choose to live within those confines of your limitations.
Yeah, I even think, you were reading through the list of narcissistic behaviors. I'm not saying I have those, but there are definitely a handful of those you read that I can have even my own process of thinking, like, I sense the temptation to do that. I can sense times when I was either immature or in a compromised place where it would have been easier to, I'm not going to delegate something in leadership, or I'm going to just do this myself. I don't want to do it this way. It's more difficult to involve other people to sit and listen instead of just tell them what to do. Like, I think we can, some of us could even sense that the draw in any sort of leadership position within, or maybe just in family. I don't want to be a narcissistic dad.
For sure. And this is why there's got to be a sense of humility because, narcissism is sort of a spectrum. We all have some of those characteristics or qualities, but the vast majority of us don't have the power to actually act that way without consequence. And that's what the spotlight does. And it doesn't happen in an instant. If it did, most people would reject it. Yeah. But see, what happens is it's so insidious, and it's like the frog in the kettle. It doesn't just happen overnight, but it gradually acts on the pastor. And before they know it, they're spending more time in the spotlight than actually serving people, even though if you ask them at the very beginning, why are you getting into this? It'd be to serve people.
Yeah, convinced that what they're doing is actually what is needed.
Yes.
Yeah.
So one thing you said, Josiah, that I really liked was that you have to actively work against kind of being sucked up into this, especially if you are that person who's, front and center a lot and maybe institutionally within the structure, the hierarchical structure, like you are kind of high up, like the more you're in that position, the more you're going to have to really intentionally and proactively embrace your limits, seek solitude, seek obscurity, like all of those things. So how do we do that? I mean, many of us aren't lead pastors, but how do we as a church shift away from being like hyper-focused on one person? How do we shift away from having a personality-driven culture? What do you guys say?
Well, the first thing I would say is to prioritize character over competency. We need to once again regain this conviction that character matters more than anything else. Now, I'm not saying, and Katie, you gave this caveat, that competency doesn't matter. I'm not saying it doesn't matter. But what I would say is that character matters more. And I think we need to regain this deep conviction that character will have a more lasting impact on others than giftedness or skill ever will. That who a person is matters more than what they can do when you're in leadership. Scott and Laura put it this way in their book. They said, character matters more than culture. Character matters more than strategy. It is character that determines the very substance of where we're headed. It isn't just what we do, but who we are. It all comes down to character. And again, in talking about how that job description and that qualification change happened, how this has been reversed, I think it's also been confused in the church. So maybe to take this one step further, I think we have to be careful not to equate ability with character, because they're not the same thing, right? I think in many churches, we sort of mistaken ability with character. And when ability replaces character, we get toxicity in the boardroom and the pulpit. And those toxicities eventually corrupt the entire culture. So I remember this quote by Diane Langberg, who wrote a great book on power in the church. And she said, never assume that someone who is gifted verbally and has theological knowledge is spiritually wise and mature. See what I'm saying? So we need to put a premium on character. We can no longer prioritize competency over character, but it's also important that we don't confuse gifting or ability with character. Those are not the same thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It does. And yet, I was just going to say, and yet it feels like we do that a lot.
Yeah.
Well, let me give you an example of just practically. I have a friend who's a pastor, and when he took the job at the church he's currently at, this church used the top search firm for churches today, Vanderbloemen. And so if a church has lots of money and they have a key position they need to fill, you can actually hire them to come in and sort of write the job description, the candidate profile, and run that search for you, find the candidate, and then sort of bring you in at the final stage of interviewing. So that's how Vanderbloemen, oversaw the search that eventually led him to joining this church. So we were talking about this very thing one time over coffee, about how character, it seems to be on the back burner when it should really be front and center. And he told me that in the entire process, from start to finish of being interviewed for this pastoral position, there wasn't a single question that was asked that assessed his character. It was all theological and rooted in competency and experience. Nothing, not a single question was about who that person is as a person. That's terrifying to me.
Yeah, I can say I've been in many interviews on both sides of the table that are the same. Granted, not in a church setting, but it feels like, especially in a church, we should care a lot about character, right? Like that's what Jesus is all about, is building our character as disciples. So I hear that and I see it, and it makes me wonder, well, man, I certainly see how we've prioritized competency over character. And it's good to unpack how we got there.
You said something it's making me think.
Okay.
You're sort of naming, correct me if I'm wrong, you're naming scripture fluency as a mark of an ability and competency, not necessarily a mark of character.
Yes, that is what I'm saying. I mean,
it doesn't mean that it wouldn't be the outworking of good character, that you care about being disciplined and studying and learning and growing in all of that. But I just think it's an interesting distinction that the scripture fluency would be an ability to quote that. It's not necessarily the mark of character.
Yeah. I mean, I had 2 professors in college who went to Marquette for their doctoral program. And we'd regularly get lunch together, and they would tell me about the professors they had who did not believe that Jesus died and rose again. Like they were not Christians, But man, did they know the scriptures inside and out. And they learned more from those professors than probably any other professors because their beliefs were under scrutiny. So they actually had to, like, when they were writing things, participating in the classroom, there was a sense of like greater accountability because there wasn't alignment between the two of them. Yeah. So just think about that. You have someone teaching theology at a doctorate level, and they're not following Jesus. So why would we equate those two? That you can know the Bible. Even Scripture says this. Like, dude, Satan knows the Bible inside and out. Quotes it to Jesus, right?
Yeah, and of course we're not saying there's no use for it. We're simply just stating that maybe these are just another. It's another one of those metrics that we've used to assess a pastor's quote unquote character, but when it comes to their personal life and their daily walk with Jesus, how well they know their theology inside and out isn't necessarily the mark of character that we're looking for.
Yes.
And we have to be clear.
Or need to be looking for, yeah.
Yeah, and we just want to be clear that they're different things. Both important, but different. Yeah, so Mac, I hear you saying prioritizing character over competency is one way that we can help guard against the church being personality driven. Another one I would name that we've stated earlier in the episode is develop a team model of leadership. So we did an entire episode on this in our value series, our first series. So I'd encourage you to go back and listen to that. But the basic idea is that we lead by sharing power. Decisions are, for the most part, made by teams of people, not just by one person. Not to say there aren't ever times when one person has to make a decision, but rather we have a culture that values many voices speaking into important matters, and we value those many voices. And granted, I think it does make it more difficult at times to make decisions because it requires more time, more conversation, et cetera, but you almost always end up with a better outcome, one that reflects the diverse perspectives of your congregation. And again, one where like ownership and responsibility and accountability is shared by a group of people because they've all had an opportunity to speak into the direction the church is heading.
I would second that also by naming like this is the biblical model that we see in the New Testament. Caitlin Beatty in her book, Celebrities for Jesus, she says a plurality of leadership and divisions of power are core to the New Testament vision of the church. In a megachurch where the pastor is the visionary, founder, and CEO all in one, it's hard to know how much elders can really do. An elder board often gives the appearance of accountability while in practice rubber stamping the leader's agenda. So it's to say that this isn't just like, oh, this is a good idea. I think you're hard-pressed to look at the New Testament and go, oh, yeah, this is how the New Testament envisions church leadership. One person sort of being the visionary person, the founder, the CEO, with a group of elders who are rubber stamping their decision. That's just not what we see.
Yeah. Mac, I'd be curious. I've heard you talk about it before, but your experience of wanting, having vision for a team model of leadership, how much work does it take to make sure that continues to happen?
It takes a lot of work. Like
I'm guessing, and just to expound, you have mentioned it before, and from what I've gathered, it almost seems like there's this stream of movement that's trying to like get you to make decisions, and you have to actively resist it.
Yeah, I think I don't know if I should be doing this or not. So just stream of consciousness here. But
Adam can cut it if we need it.
Yeah, I think one thing that helps me not overfunction and take responsibility, and I don't do this perfectly. There probably are times where I've driven a decision and then the group is like catching up, right? But I think maybe a metaphor that's helped me is to think about myself in the boardroom as a consultant, rather than the person who's like calling the shots. If you're a good consultant, you're coming into a church and empowering that church to make decisions as you guide them and speaking to them with your expertise or your, whatever you bring to the table. And I find that I'm like doing my best when I'm sort of pivoting out of that. Doesn't mean I abrogate my voice or don't exercise my voice. In that sense, I probably have a little bit more say-so than a consultant, but that helps me, at least knowing my personality, kind of pump the brakes where I'd normally be tempted to push really hard. I think one of the telltale signs of whether you're doing this or not is whether at least sometimes you're not getting your way. a decision goes differently than you wanted it to go or thought it should go. The final thing I'll say, and I've mentioned this before in previous episodes, is this requires a high degree of relational maturity among the team. You need people who can step into that space with self-differentiation. And that means not overpowering and dominating others, but also, and I'm learning this, not shrinking back and saying things you really need to say. That's just as detrimental to a team of people than the domineering person. So anyways, thoughts off the cuff.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, if the job of the leadership within church is to equip the saints for the work of ministry, then the person at the top should be doing the most equipping and maybe like empowering others to be doing the work and not trying to do all the work themselves.
Yeah, and I want to say to our listeners, I'm not doing this perfectly.
We know.
I have...
Just kidding.
I do. I'm always trying to grow into this and have a lot of people that I get coaching from to help me continue to hopefully do this decently well.
Yeah, I like that. Another way, which is a little bit on the line of that. So if we're developing a team model of leadership, we also need to be discipling people, like everyone who comes to church, to participate meaningfully. Right, the church is the sum total of everyone's participation, not just the work of the leader, if we're trying not to be a personality-driven culture. So yeah, if we want to decenter our community from revolving around one person, well, then the process is going to involve, you need a discipleship pipeline that develops people and allows them to contribute meaningfully. And this is, I would assume that every church on the planet has work to do in this, especially in our Western, very individualistic culture. The stream, as I was talking about, is in our culture is outside of church, is constantly pushing towards what works best for you and wanting to consume. And it will take active work within a church to make sure that there are pipelines and ways that people can contribute meaningfully with and express their gift and make our church better.
Yeah, and it's so interesting to me thinking about this like technology age that we're in, where we have so much information at our fingertips. And I could never walk foot in a church building and listen to like different pastors and podcasts and books on tape. Like there's so much out there that I could listen to and think that I'm, growing spiritually. But if I'm not in an actual building, I'm not going to be discipled. So I think that's such a critical piece of this, right? Like me as the person wanting to walk with Christ and wanting people around me to help guide me in that, it's my responsibility to be a part of a church where I can be discipled in the context of relationship. That's different from consuming information. Even though sometimes I feel like when I'm listening to podcasts, it's like, oh yeah, that's great. Like I'm learning things and those are great insights and I can take some of it. And, it's like, well, how am I actually living my life? How am I working this out? And I think that has to be done in the context of a church. Yeah.
We do work in our leadership intensives, a year-long discipleship program that we do. We do work having to sort of deconstruct this idea and model that we've had for discipleship in the past. So discipleship is not consuming sermons. Like that is like learning, of course, is and consuming information, of course, is part of it. But discipleship is a lot more expansive than that. It involves being relationally connected to the people around you and discerning together and ultimately discovering what it looks like for you to meaningfully contribute to the community around you instead of just sitting back and consuming.
Yep. Downloading information doesn't lead to transformation. Now, there's a sense in which you can't act on what you don't know. So information is valuable. But if you look at how Jesus discipled the disciples, there was teaching. He provided them with information and frameworks and challenged some of their worldview, and he taught on the kingdom. So there was information, but it immediately led to practice. Go practice this. Go try this. And then there's usually failure. They usually weren't able to do it, and they'd come back and have a feedback loop, some reflection to go, how did that go? And then we'll keep going. And you need a community. You sitting there on your couch listening to a sermon isn't going to be the same as being part of a community where you're learning, acting, and reflecting as a group of people. which is part of the reason why this podcast is called Praxis, because it's all about practicing the way of Jesus together as a community. So what a perfect transition to go, okay, how can we give our listeners some concrete practices in light of this? And I know much of what we've been talking about has sort of centered on leaders and that revolving around leaders, but I'll remind people of our systems thinking to go, this doesn't happen without everyone's sort of complicit, maybe even passive cooperation. So what are some things that our listeners can do to, join us in pushing back against this toxin in the soil that does not produce goodness or good fruit? And I'll just start by naming the first one because you guys already name it, but just do a language audit. Katie, you mentioned so many people refer to a church as the lead pastor's church. And I just want to say, knock it off. Just don't do that. That's not how the Bible talks about New Testament churches. It's usually based on location, the church in Ephesus, the church in Corinth, or whatever. In fact, in Corinthians, when they tried to build the church around a person, some saying, I'm of Peter, others, I'm of Apollos, Paul had some harsh words for them. Yeah. Right? So the church doesn't belong to your lead pastor. It belongs to Jesus. I don't know how to refer it. Just if you belong to Crosspoint, I go to Crosspoint. That's the church that I participate and am discipled in, right? Mm-hmm. But please don't refer to it as my church or any other staff member's church because it doesn't belong to me.
Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah, that's a good one. A second practice I would name is learn to hear from God through multiple voices. Okay, so we've talked about how having like this church that's built around one pastor can easily kind of give the impression that that person like speaks for God. Like they have the spiritual authority in the church and they're the only person that can speak God's voice in my life. And that's not good. There's not only one person, that gets that spiritual authority. So this is important. I grew up, I think, hearing God's voice primarily just through maybe one person, like the lead pastor at our church. And then I went to college and went to another church, and then in law school and I went to another church. And I didn't have access to, podcasts like we do now. And so the people that I heard God's voice through had lots of good things to say, but they were all kind of similar, demographic, life experience, et cetera, like, older males in 50s or 60s, kind of grew up in a similar context. And so it wasn't until my 30s that I really started expanding my circle of who I listened to, especially on spiritual matters. Like I started to listening to podcasts and sermons and reading books by women, which was really good because I'm a woman. And so I was like, oh, well, this adds something to my understanding of who God is and how he could be at work in my life. And people in other countries, people who live in this country but have had a different upbringing. There's so many different voices out there. Everyone's got a different life experience and a different journey. And the cool thing about God is that he created and wired all of us, and he knows our journey and he knows our context, and he, I think, meets us there and speaks to us within our context. And so everyone is going to bring something different to the table. And so we can benefit from that. Like we can benefit by expanding who we listen to when we're trying to learn about the things of God.
Yeah, this is why we're committed to a team model of preaching, because preaching is God's truth through a personality, and we believe there are multiple personalities that are going to equip and give our church a well-rounded hearing and responding of God's word, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. But maybe practically, that means that don't just come when your favorite preacher is up.
Yeah.
It shouldn't matter who's preaching. Just come with an openness and a receptivity to how might God speak to me today through whoever is up, right? And I say that knowing I'm not everybody's favorite. I know some people who definitely prefer Cameron speaking over mine. Great. But still come when I preach, or if you think, hey, I like Mac the best. I don't care. Come when others are speaking, because it's about, this is an opportunity for you to very openly and humbly listen for the voice of God at work in your life and the life of our community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. Another practice would be just to consider your own participation. What does it look like for you to participate within this community? I think maybe just start by attending the entire service.
Yeah, dude,
Explain
right.
what you mean by that, Josiah.
yeah.
If we are picking and choose who our preachers are, I know that it's tempting to take it even a step further and be like, oh, I don't like that part of the service, I'll show up late, or I don't want to stay late because I don't necessarily want to talk to people at the end. Consider what it would look like to participate in the entire thing. To maybe arrive a little early and stay late. That doesn't require very much at all. And ask the Holy Spirit how he might be inviting you to contribute. Mm-hmm. And I would imagine that you might see more areas than you are aware of when you only attend sporadically or parceled.
I often feel bad for you guys during the first song.
I know, that's what I was thinking.
I'm standing often at the
there's
front
two people
door.
here today.
Yep. But but it is. It's like if you show up early and prioritize relational connection and are present for the entire service and stay a little bit after, it just opens up opportunities to be part of what God's doing, rather than again treating as like, okay, I'm just going to attend for this little snippet that I like, and then I'm out, as if I got my needs met.
Yeah. And I'm not even trying to say this isn't a rant about if you show up late to worship. It's more about, we talked earlier, there's this flow our whole culture is trying to push towards things that are unhealthy in church. And it takes active work to say, no, I'm not going to just go with the flow of what's happening or what I normally would want in other areas. We're saying that being a part of a church community, we all want to have a healthy culture. And all of us, it's going to take all of us to have one. And if you find yourself with limited participation, sitting on the outside, there may be some very small steps you could do to say, no, I want to be a part of it too. And it doesn't necessarily mean, serving 3 times a week and being here all the time. Just simply saying, I want to be a part of that. And I'm going to take ownership of what it looks like for this to be a healthy community.
That's solid. All right, guys. Well, big picture, this celebrityism that's in the culture is truly a toxin in the soil of the American church. Building the church around a single person does not lead to a healthy church or a healthy church culture. The church is the sum total of everyone's participation, and healthy churches learn how to equip and empower all those who wish to contribute and to participate.
Well, thanks for joining us today. We really hope you enjoyed today's episode. Next time, we are going to take some time and name a second toxin in the American church soil and how to pivot toward greater health as a church. We hope you continue to join us.
Praxis is recorded and produced at Crosspoint Community Church. You can find out more about the show and our church at crosspointwi.com. If you have any questions, comments, or have any suggestions for future topics, feel free to send us an email. Also, if you enjoy the show, consider leaving a review. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.